Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never imagined they could hurt you? Have you ever been in a situation where people laughed while you suffered, calling it harmless fun? Well, let me tell you about the day my entire perspective on friendship, trust, and self-respect changed forever. This is the story of how a so-called prank landed me in the hospital, how my friends dismissed my pain as me being dramatic, and how I decided to teach them a lesson they would never forget by doing something they never saw coming. I'm going to share every detail with you because what happened to me changed not just my relationships, but the very core of who I am as a person. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what matters is what I went through and how I found the strength to stand up for myself when everyone around me expected me to just laugh it off and move on. Before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand something about me. I've always been the easygoing one in my friend group, the person who goes with the flow, the one who laughs at jokes even when they're at my expense because I never wanted to be seen as sensitive or unable to take a joke. Growing up, I learned that being accommodating meant being liked, and being liked felt safe. I had this group of friends I'd known since college, people I considered family, people I would have trusted with my life. We had history together, countless memories, inside jokes that nobody else would understand, and a bond I genuinely believed was unbreakable. We celebrated birthdays together, supported each other through breakups and job losses, stayed up late talking about our dreams and fears, and I honestly thought these people knew me, respected me, and cared about my well-being. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The small moments where boundaries were pushed just a little too far, where jokes became slightly too cruel, where my discomfort was met with, "Come on, don't be so sensitive," instead of understanding. But at the time, I brushed it all aside because I wanted to belong. I wanted to be part of something, and I was willing to tolerate discomfort to maintain those connections. I never imagined that one day, their idea of fun would put me in a hospital bed, fighting not just physical pain, but the devastating realization that the people I trusted most saw my suffering as entertainment. The day it happened started like any other weekend. We had planned a get-together at Jake's place. Nothing fancy, just the usual group hanging out, maybe ordering some food, watching movies, playing video games, the kind of casual gathering we'd done 100 times before. I remember feeling happy that morning, excited even, because it had been a stressful week at work, and I was looking forward to unwinding with people I cared about. I showed up around noon, carrying a bag of snacks I'd picked up on the way, completely unaware that I was walking into a situation that would fundamentally alter my life. When I arrived, everyone was already there, which was unusual because I'm typically not the last one to show up, but I didn't think much of it at the time. They greeted me with smiles and hugs, and everything seemed normal, comfortable, familiar. We settled into our usual spots in Jake's living room, a space I'd been in countless times, surrounded by faces I knew as well as my own family. The conversation flowed easily. We laughed about things happening at work, discussed a new show someone had started watching, debated where we should order dinner from later, all the mundane, wonderful details of friendship that make life feel rich and full. But there was something in the air that day. An energy I couldn't quite put my finger on, an undercurrent of excitement that seemed slightly off, like everyone was in on something I wasn't aware of. I caught a few exchanged glances, some barely suppressed grins, and I remember thinking they were probably planning to surprise me with something for my upcoming birthday, which was still a couple of weeks away. I felt touched by the idea, warmed by the thought that they were going to such lengths to make me feel special. How wrong I was about what they were actually planning. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something wasn't right, but you ignored it because you didn't want to seem paranoid or ruin the mood? That's exactly where I was. I pushed down the slight unease I felt and focused on enjoying the moment, on being present with my friends, on appreciating what I thought was genuine connection and care. The afternoon progressed with the usual rhythm of our gatherings, casual conversation punctuated by laughter, someone occasionally getting up to grab drinks from the kitchen, the comfortable silence that comes from being with people you don't need to perform for. Around 3 o'clock, Sarah suggested we play a game, and everyone seemed enthusiastic about the idea. I figured it would be something we'd done before, maybe cards or a board game we'd played dozens of times, but she brought out something I'd never seen, claiming it was a new party game she'd discovered online. The premise seemed simple enough, almost childish really, involving challenges and dares that were supposed to be funny and lighthearted. I should have questioned why everyone seemed so eager to play, why there was that same electric energy I'd noticed earlier. But I was caught up in the moment, in the infectious enthusiasm that filled the room. We started playing, and the first few rounds were harmless, silly little tasks like doing impressions or answering embarrassing questions, the kind of thing that makes everyone laugh and feel closer. Then it was my turn, and Jake pulled out a card with a challenge that he said was specifically for me. I remember the exact moment, the way everyone leaned in slightly, the way their eyes gleamed with something I mistook for playful anticipation. The challenge involved drinking a special smoothie they'd prepared, and they made a big show of bringing it out from the kitchen, this thick greenish-brown concoction in a large glass. They told me it was a mixture of weird but harmless foods, things like pickle juice and hot sauce and wheatgrass, ingredients that would taste terrible together but wouldn't hurt me. They said the challenge was to drink the whole thing without stopping, and if I did it, I'd earn points that would help our team win the game. I looked at the glass, and I'll admit, I hesitated. Something in my mind whispered that this didn't feel right, that the way everyone was watching me felt wrong somehow. But I also didn't want to be the person who ruined the fun, who couldn't take a joke or participate in the game. I had spent years building my identity as the good sport, the fun friend, the one who was always up for anything, and backing down now felt like betraying who I'd worked so hard to be. So I took the glass, and as I brought it to my lips, I saw Marcus pull out his phone to record, which I thought was just for laughs, for a funny memory we'd share later. I started drinking, and immediately the taste was absolutely horrific, worse than anything I could have imagined. But I kept going because everyone was cheering me on, chanting my name, telling me I was doing great, that I was almost done. The texture was thick and chunky, and with each swallow I felt my stomach turning, my body instinctively wanting to reject what I was putting into it. But I pushed through because I wanted to make them proud. I wanted to be part of the fun. I wanted to belong. When I finally finished the entire glass, everyone erupted in applause and laughter, and for a moment I felt accomplished, like I'd passed some test of friendship and loyalty. But that feeling lasted maybe 30 seconds before everything started going terribly, horrifyingly wrong. The first thing I noticed was the heat, an intense burning sensation that started in my throat and spread rapidly through my chest, like fire-consuming dry wood. My mouth began tingling in a way that felt completely wrong, not like the tingle from spicy food, but something chemical and frightening. I tried to speak, to tell them something was wrong, but my throat felt like it was closing up, and the words came out as barely more than a whisper. I saw concern flicker across a few faces, but most of them were still laughing, still caught up in what they thought was hilarious entertainment. Within minutes, the burning intensified to a level I'd never experienced, and I could feel my heartbeat accelerating, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands started shaking uncontrollably, and then came the nausea, wave after wave of it, so intense that I doubled over, clutching my stomach. I stumbled toward the bathroom, barely making it before I started vomiting violently. And I mean violently in a way I'd never experienced before, my entire body convulsing with the effort to expel whatever poison they'd given me. Between the waves of vomiting, I tried to breathe, but my chest felt tight, like someone was sitting on it, applying pressure that made each breath a struggle. I could hear them outside the bathroom door, and this is the part that still haunts me. They were laughing. Not concerned voices asking if I was okay. Not worried friends wondering if they should call for help, but actual laughter. The sound of people who thought what was happening to me was funny. I heard someone say, "Oh my God, they really can't handle it." And another person replied, "This is going exactly as planned. Wait until the second phase kicks in." Those words cut through my panic for just a moment. The realization that this wasn't an accident, that whatever was happening to me was intentional, was part of their plan, their prank. The betrayal I felt in that moment was almost as painful as the physical symptoms racking my body. I managed to get the bathroom door open, and I collapsed onto the floor in the hallway, and that's when they finally seemed to realize something was seriously wrong. My lips had started swelling, my breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and I could feel hives breaking out across my skin, raised and itchy and spreading rapidly. Sarah's face went pale as she looked at me, and she said something to Jake about this not being what was supposed to happen, that I was only supposed to feel sick for a little while, not have this kind of reaction. Through the haze of pain and confusion, I tried to understand what they'd actually put in that drink, what they'd done to me, but focusing on anything beyond the immediate crisis of my body shutting down was impossible. Someone, I think it was Marcus, finally had the sense to call 911, and I remember lying there on Jake's floor, surrounded by these people I'd called friends, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The wait for the ambulance felt eternal, every second stretching into minutes, and I kept fading in and out of consciousness, my body going into what I later learned was anaphylactic shock. I have a vague memory of the paramedics arriving, of being loaded onto a stretcher, of an oxygen mask being placed over my face, of someone starting an IV in my arm, but it all felt distant and unreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was seeing my friends standing in Jake's doorway, watching me being taken away, and not one of them looked guilty or sorry. They looked annoyed, inconvenienced, like I'd ruined their fun by having the audacity to have a medical emergency. I woke up in a hospital room with fluorescent lights burning into my eyes and the steady beep of monitors tracking my vital signs. My throat felt raw, my entire body ached, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came flooding back. The drink, the burning, the betrayal, and I felt tears sliding down my face before I could stop them. A nurse came in when she saw I was awake, her face kind and concerned, and she explained that I'd had a severe allergic reaction combined with chemical burns to my esophagus and stomach lining. She told me they'd had to pump my stomach, that I'd been given epinephrine and antihistamines, that I'd been unconscious for several hours, and that I was lucky my friends had called 911 when they did because another 15 minutes could have been fatal. Fatal. That word echoed in my mind. I could have died from their prank. When I asked her what had caused the reaction, she said the emergency room doctor would come talk to me, but that based on what the paramedics reported and what they'd found in my system, it appeared I'd ingested a mixture that included substances I was severely allergic to, along with household chemicals that should never be consumed. Household chemicals? They'd put cleaning products in my drink. The doctor came in about an hour later and confirmed my worst fears. The smoothie had contained not just food items, but also small amounts of drain cleaner and concentrated detergent, which had caused chemical burns, along with shellfish extract, which I'm deathly allergic to. A fact my friends knew because I'd had a reaction at a restaurant 2 years earlier when my food was cross-contaminated. They knew. They knew I was allergic, and they put it in anyway because they thought watching me suffer would be entertaining. The doctor explained that I would need to stay hospitalized for at least 2 days for observation, that I'd need to be on medication for the chemical burns, and that there could be long-term damage to my digestive system that wouldn't be apparent for weeks or months. He asked me if I wanted to file a police report, and I was so overwhelmed, so shattered by everything that had happened, that I couldn't even process the question. I just lay there, hooked up to IVs and monitors, feeling utterly destroyed, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. The person I'd been that morning, the trusting friend who showed up with snacks and a smile, felt like someone from another lifetime. My phone had been in my pocket when the ambulance took me, and when I finally had the strength to look at it, I saw dozens of messages in our group chat. My hands trembled as I opened it, part of me desperately hoping to see apologies, expressions of concern, promises that they were on their way to the hospital to check on me. Instead, what I found made me feel physically ill all over again. The messages were them laughing about the prank, sharing the video Marcus had taken, discussing how dramatic my reaction had been, how I'd totally overreacted to what was supposed to be a harmless joke. Sarah had written, "Okay, but seriously, they need to learn to take a joke. This is ridiculous." And Jake had responded, "For real, we were just having fun. It's not our fault they can't handle it." Not one message asked how I was doing. Not one person suggested visiting me. Not one single expression of remorse or concern. Just annoyance that I'd spoiled their afternoon by ending up in the hospital. Have you ever experienced a moment where you see people's true nature so clearly that you can never unsee it? That was my moment. Lying in that hospital bed, reading those messages, understanding that these people I'd loved and trusted saw me as nothing more than entertainment, a prop in their games, someone whose well-being mattered less than their amusement. I spent 2.5 days in the hospital, and during that entire time, not one of them came to visit me. Not one of them called to check on me. Not one of them sent so much as a "hope you're okay" text to me directly. The only communication was in the group chat, where they continued discussing their weekend plans as if nothing had happened, as if I didn't exist, as if they hadn't nearly killed me. My family was out of state, and I'd chosen not to worry them until I was discharged and could downplay what had happened. So I spent those days alone except for the nurses and doctors who cared for me with more compassion than my supposed friends had shown in years. I had a lot of time to think during those long hospital hours, time to reflect on patterns I'd ignored, to recognize all the ways I'd diminished myself to maintain friendships that were fundamentally unequal and unhealthy. I thought about all the times I'd laughed off comments that hurt my feelings, all the times I'd gone along with things I wasn't comfortable with, all the times I'd prioritized their enjoyment over my own dignity and safety. I realized that I'd been so afraid of being alone that I'd accepted being treated as less than, and that realization was both devastating and liberating. The night before I was discharged, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to pretend it was fine, laugh it off, and move forward as if nothing had happened. They wanted to call it a prank, to minimize what they'd done, to escape any consequences for their actions. But pranks don't put people in the hospital. Pranks don't cause chemical burns and anaphylactic shock. Pranks don't involve deliberately exposing someone to substances you know they're deathly allergic to. What they'd done wasn't a prank, it was assault, and I was going to make sure they understood that. When I was finally discharged, I went home to my apartment, still weak and in pain, with a bag full of medications and strict dietary restrictions for the foreseeable future. My throat hurt every time I swallowed. My stomach was a mess, and I couldn't keep down solid food yet. I was supposed to be on medical leave from work for at least another week, and every physical movement reminded me of what had been done to me. But more than the physical pain, I was consumed by anger, righteous fury at the injustice of what had happened and their complete lack of accountability for it. I sat at my kitchen table that first night home, surrounded by the hospital paperwork and prescription bottles, and I started adding up the costs. The ambulance ride had cost over $1,000 even with insurance. The emergency room visit, the hospital stay, the medications, the follow-up appointments I'd need, it was all adding up to an astronomical figure that I couldn't afford on my modest salary. And beyond the medical expenses, there was the money I'd lose from missing work, the cost of the special foods I'd need to eat while I recovered, the replacement clothes I'd need because mine had been ruined and the hospital had to cut my shirt off me in the ER. They had cost me thousands of dollars and they didn't even care. They thought it was funny. They thought I deserved it for not being able to take a joke. That's when the idea came to me. Clear and perfect. And absolutely right. If they wanted to call it a prank, fine. But pranks have consequences, and I was going to make sure they faced those consequences in a language they couldn't dismiss or ignore. I was going to send them an itemized invoice for every single penny their prank had cost me, and I was going to demand they pay it. The next morning, despite still feeling weak and shaky, I got to work with a determination I'd never felt before. I gathered every piece of documentation I had, every hospital bill, every prescription receipt, every piece of evidence of the harm they'd caused. I created a spreadsheet with meticulous detail, listing each expense down to the cent. Ambulance transport, $1,237. Emergency room care, $3,412. Hospital stay, 2 nights, $6,893. Medications, $426. Lost wages for 1 week of missed work, $960. Replacement clothing, $83. Special dietary foods for recovery period, estimated $250. Future medical expenses for follow-up appointments and potential ongoing treatment, estimated $1,500. The total came to over $16,000, a number so staggering that I had to double-check my math several times to believe it. $16,000 because they thought it would be funny to poison me. As I worked on the invoice, I realized I needed to include more than just the financial costs. I added a section detailing the physical harm, the chemical burns to my esophagus and stomach, the anaphylactic shock, the ongoing digestive issues, the potential for long-term complications. I included quotes from my medical records, technical language that made the severity undeniable. I wanted them to see in clinical terms exactly what they'd done to my body, but I didn't stop there. I also included the emotional and psychological impact, the trauma of being betrayed by people I trusted, the anxiety I now felt around food and drinks prepared by others, the nightmares I'd been having about not being able to breathe, the way I flinched when my phone buzzed with notifications from our group chat. I wanted the invoice to be a mirror held up to their actions, showing them the full scope of the destruction they'd caused while they were busy laughing and high-fiving each other. I spent hours perfecting the document, making sure every detail was accurate and verifiable, that the tone was professional and unemotional, that it looked like something that could hold up in court if it came to that. At the top, I wrote a brief introduction explaining that this invoice detailed the costs associated with the incident on the specified date at Jake's residence, and that payment was expected within 30 days. I kept it cold, factual, businesslike. I didn't accuse them of assault or attempted murder or any of the things I felt they were guilty of. I simply presented the facts and the costs, letting the numbers speak for themselves. When I finished, I sat back and looked at the document with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in days. This was power, the power of accountability, the power of refusing to be dismissed or diminished. I wasn't screaming at them or begging them to understand what they'd done to me. I was simply presenting them with a bill for services rendered, their services being nearly killing me for their entertainment. Have you ever felt that moment when you stop being a victim and start being someone who refuses to accept mistreatment? That was my moment. I was done shrinking myself, done accepting their narrative that I was too sensitive or couldn't take a joke. I was presenting them with objective reality, with numbers that couldn't be argued with or laughed off, and I was demanding they take responsibility for their actions. I sent the invoice individually to each person who had been there that day, all 7 of them, via email with a read receipt so I'd know they'd opened it. I also printed physical copies and mailed them via certified mail to their home addresses, creating a paper trail that couldn't be ignored or deleted. Then I waited. The response came faster than I expected. Within an hour of sending the emails, my phone started blowing up with messages, but this time they weren't in the group chat where they could perform for each other. These were individual messages, and they ran the full spectrum from aggressive to manipulative to outright threatening. Jake sent me a long text calling me petty and vindictive, saying I was trying to ruin everyone's lives over an accident, that they hadn't meant for me to get hurt, and that sending them a bill was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever seen. Sarah's message was more manipulative, full of hurt feelings about how I was destroying our friendship over money, how she couldn't believe I cared more about dollars than our years of history together, how disappointed she was that I would turn something that was meant to be fun into such a big deal. Marcus sent a one-line text, "You can't actually be serious about this." Others sent variations on the same theme, all of them positioning themselves as the victims of my unreasonable demands, all of them conveniently forgetting that they'd put me in the hospital. Not one of them apologized. Not one of them acknowledged what they'd done was wrong. Not one of them offered to pay even a portion of what they owed. Instead, they doubled down on calling it a prank, an accident, something I should be able to laugh about now that I was fine, as if being discharged from the hospital meant I was magically healed from both the physical and emotional trauma they'd inflicted. I didn't respond to any of the messages. I'd said everything I needed to say in the invoice, and I wasn't going to be drawn into defending my right to be compensated for harm they'd caused. Instead, I started documenting everything. Screenshots of their messages admitting they'd given me the drink. Records of the video Marcus had taken showing them encouraging me to drink it. The group chat messages dismissing my hospitalization as dramatic overreaction. I consulted with a lawyer, a free consultation I'd found through a legal aid service. And while they told me I had a strong case for both civil and criminal action, they also warned me that pursuing it would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. I had to decide whether holding them accountable was worth the fight it would require. For a few days, I genuinely wasn't sure which path to take. Part of me was exhausted, still recovering physically and emotionally, and the thought of a prolonged legal battle felt overwhelming. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since I woke up in that hospital bed, knew that I couldn't let this go, that if I did, I'd be teaching them and myself that their actions had no consequences, that I could be harmed without any recourse. I thought about all the other people they might do this to in the future, all the other victims of their cruel sense of humor, and I realized that my silence wouldn't just harm me, it would enable them to keep hurting others. The turning point came about a week after I'd sent the invoice when I ran into Sarah at a grocery store, my first time leaving the apartment for something other than a doctor's appointment. I was still moving carefully, my stomach sensitive to everything, trying to find bland foods I could actually keep down, when I saw her in the produce section. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I could see her calculating whether to approach me or pretend she hadn't seen me. She chose to approach, and I'll never forget the words that came out of her mouth. She walked up to me with this bright fake smile and said, "Hey, glad to see you're doing better. So when are you going to drop this whole invoice thing? It's getting really uncomfortable for everyone. Not how are you feeling, not I'm sorry we hurt you, but a request that I stop making things uncomfortable for them." I looked at her, this person I'd trusted with my deepest secrets and my most vulnerable moments, and I felt something inside me harden into diamond, unbreakable and clear. I told her, my voice steady and calm, that the invoice stood, that if they didn't pay voluntarily, I would pursue legal action, and that their comfort was no longer my concern. The shock on her face was almost comical, as if she couldn't believe I was actually serious about holding them accountable. She started to argue, to tell me I was being unreasonable, but I simply turned my cart around and walked away. And that small act of putting myself first felt like the most empowering thing I'd done in years. I didn't owe her a conversation, didn't owe her the emotional labor of explaining why nearly killing someone isn't a joke, didn't owe her anything at all. When I got home from the store, I made my final decision. I filed a civil lawsuit against all 7 of them for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and emotional distress. I also filed a police report detailing what had happened, providing all the evidence I'd collected, and requesting that charges be filed for assault and reckless endangerment. The lawyer I'd consulted with agreed to take my case on a contingency basis after reviewing all my documentation, confident that we had a strong case. The moment I signed those papers, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was no longer carrying this alone, no longer responsible for making them understand or care. The legal system would handle that now, and whether they wanted to acknowledge what they'd done or not, they would face consequences. The next few months were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. The lawsuit and criminal investigation became consuming, requiring depositions and statements and endless documentation. My former friends hired lawyers and began a campaign to discredit me, spreading rumors that I was mentally unstable, that I'd faked or exaggerated my injuries, that I was only doing this for money. Some mutual acquaintances believed them and cut me off, apparently deciding that maintaining neutrality meant siding with the perpetrators. I lost not just those 7 friendships, but several others in the periphery, people who decided that I was causing too much drama or making things too complicated. There were days when I questioned whether it was worth it, whether I should have just moved on and tried to forget what happened. But then I'd have a follow-up doctor's appointment and be reminded of the ongoing medical issues I was facing, or I'd have a nightmare about not being able to breathe, or I'd see the scars on my throat when I looked in the mirror, and I knew I'd made the right choice. They had hurt me, they had refused to take responsibility, and if I didn't hold them accountable, nobody would. The civil case moved forward steadily, and their lawyers tried every tactic to get it dismissed, arguing that it was just a prank gone wrong, that I was partially responsible for drinking the smoothie, that the damages I was claiming were inflated. But the medical records didn't lie. The video Marcus had taken showed them encouraging me to drink something they knew contained allergens, and the group chat messages where they discussed their plans beforehand proved premeditation. Yes, I eventually discovered there were messages from the night before where they'd planned the whole thing, discussing what ingredients would be the most disgusting, and debating whether to tell me afterward or let me figure it out on my own. The evidence was overwhelming, and even their own lawyers seemed to know they were fighting a losing battle. About 6 months after I filed the lawsuit, their legal team approached mine with a settlement offer. They proposed paying my medical expenses, but nothing for pain and suffering or emotional distress, essentially offering to cover the bare minimum they were legally liable for. My lawyer advised me that if we went to trial, I'd likely win significantly more, but that trials are unpredictable, and going through one would be traumatic in its own way. I had to decide whether I wanted the guaranteed settlement or to risk it all for the possibility of greater justice. I thought about what I really wanted from this process. Yes, I wanted them to pay for what they'd done, but more than that, I wanted them to acknowledge it, to admit that what they'd done was wrong, to take responsibility in a way that went beyond just writing a check. I told my lawyer I'd accept the settlement only if it included 3 things: full payment of all medical expenses and lost wages, a written apology from each of them acknowledging what they'd done and the harm it caused, and an agreement that they would never contact me again. To my surprise, they agreed. I think by that point they just wanted the whole thing to go away, and admitting fault in a private settlement seemed preferable to having it all aired out in a public trial. When I received the settlement check along with the written apologies, I sat in my apartment and read each one carefully. They were clearly written by lawyers, carefully worded to admit responsibility while minimizing culpability, but they existed, acknowledgement in writing that what they'd done was wrong. It wasn't the tearful, heartfelt apology I'd once imagined wanting, but it was something, a small measure of justice in a world that often provides none. The criminal case was more complicated. The district attorney pursued charges, but ultimately they were able to plea down to misdemeanor assault and were sentenced to community service and probation rather than jail time. Part of me felt frustrated that they weren't facing harsher consequences, but another part of me recognized that the legal system had at least acknowledged that a crime had been committed, that their actions had crossed the line from prank into assault. They would have criminal records now, consequences that would follow them far beyond whatever community service hours they had to complete. Through all of this, I was also doing the hard work of healing, both physically and emotionally. The chemical burns to my digestive system left me with chronic issues that required ongoing medication and dietary management. I had to completely change how I ate, what I ate, when I ate, adjusting my entire life around the damage they'd caused. I started therapy to work through the trauma, to address not just what had happened, but the patterns in my life that had led me to tolerate mistreatment for so long. My therapist helped me understand that my people-pleasing tendencies, my fear of being alone, my willingness to diminish my own needs to maintain relationships, These were all things I developed as survival mechanisms at some point, but they were no longer serving me. They were actively harming me. I had to learn how to set boundaries, how to recognize red flags in relationships, how to value myself enough to walk away from situations that didn't honor my well-being. It was painful work, facing all the ways I'd betrayed myself in the name of belonging, but it was also liberating. I started to discover who I was when I wasn't performing for others' approval, when I wasn't shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. I found that I actually liked the person I was becoming, someone who stood up for themselves, who didn't accept mistreatment, who valued their own dignity and safety above being liked. I also had to rebuild my ability to trust, which had been shattered into 1,000 pieces that day at Jake's house. I found myself suspicious of everyone's motives, unable to accept invitations without wondering what the catch was, flinching away from friendly gestures because I'd learned that people who claimed to care about me could hurt me in unimaginable ways. My therapist worked with me on this, helping me understand that while those 7 people had proven themselves untrustworthy, that didn't mean everyone was dangerous, that it was possible to be discerning without being closed off, to protect myself without isolating myself. Slowly, carefully, I started building new friendships with people who showed through consistent actions that they respected boundaries, who communicated honestly, who treated me with the basic human decency I'd been denied by my former friends. These new relationships felt different, healthier, built on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. I learned to pay attention to how people made me feel, to trust my instincts when something felt off, to walk away from situations that didn't serve me even if it meant being alone. And I discovered that being alone was actually better than being surrounded by people who saw me as a target for their amusement. About a year after everything happened, after the settlements were paid and the criminal case was resolved and I'd done months of therapy and healing work, I did something that felt both terrifying and necessary. I wrote about my experience and published it online, not naming names but telling the story in detail, explaining what had happened and how I'd responded. I wanted other people who'd been hurt by cruel pranks, or dismissed when they tried to hold others accountable to know they weren't alone, that it was possible to stand up for yourself, that their pain mattered even if the people who caused it refused to acknowledge it. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people reached out to share their own stories of being hurt by pranks, of having their pain dismissed as sensitivity, of struggling to hold friends and family members accountable for harm they'd caused. I heard from people who wished they'd had the courage to do what I did, people who were inspired to finally address their own situations, people who just needed to know someone else understood what they'd been through. Reading their stories broke my heart and filled it simultaneously. The recognition that this wasn't an isolated incident, but a widespread pattern of cruelty disguised as humor, but also the knowledge that we were creating a community of survivors who refused to accept that abuse was acceptable as long as it was framed as a joke. I also heard from some people who criticized me, who said I'd overreacted, that I was vindictive and cruel for pursuing legal action against my friends over an accident, that I should have been more forgiving. These comments stung, not because I believed them, but because they reflected the same mentality that had allowed my friends to justify their actions in the first place. The idea that maintaining relationships and keeping the peace mattered more than holding people accountable for serious harm. But I also recognized that these critics were revealing their own fears and blind spots, their own investment in a world where they could hurt others without consequences, as long as they claimed they didn't mean it. I didn't owe them explanations or justifications. I'd made my choice and I stood by it. Looking back now, more than a year later, I can say with absolute certainty that sending that itemized invoice was one of the best decisions I've ever made. It wasn't just about the money, though the settlement did cover my expenses and provide some financial security during a difficult time. It was about refusing to accept a narrative that minimized what I'd been through, about insisting that my pain mattered, that my life had value, that actions have consequences even when they're called pranks. It was about choosing myself when everyone around me was asking me to choose them, their comfort, their reputation, their freedom from accountability. It was about recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to let go of relationships that are hurting you, even when those relationships are with people you've known for years, even when letting go feels lonely and scary. I'm not going to lie and say everything is perfect now, that I've completely healed from what happened, that there aren't still moments when I struggle with trust or feel the physical effects of what they did to my body. The scars, both visible and invisible, are still with me and probably always will be. But I'm okay with that, because those scars remind me of my strength, of the day I decided I was worth fighting for, of the moment I chose dignity over the desperate need to belong. I've built a new life for myself, one with better boundaries, healthier relationships, and a much stronger sense of self-worth. I have friends now who would never dream of hurting me for entertainment, who check in when I'm quiet, who respect my needs and boundaries, who celebrate my successes and support me through struggles. I have a therapist I trust, hobbies I enjoy, a job I'm good at, and most importantly, I have myself, a version of myself I actually like and respect, someone I would be friends with if I met them. And that's worth more than any friendship I lost in the process of standing up for myself. If you're watching this and you've been through something similar, if you've been hurt by people who called it a joke, if you've been dismissed when you tried to express your pain, if you've been made to feel like you're overreacting when you're actually underreacting to serious harm, I want you to know something important. Your pain is valid. What happened to you matters. You deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, and you have every right to hold people accountable when they hurt you. It doesn't matter if they meant to hurt you or not. The impact matters more than the intention. It doesn't matter if they say it was just a joke. The harm is still real. It doesn't matter if standing up for yourself makes you unpopular or loses you friendships, because relationships that require you to accept mistreatment aren't worth keeping. You are worth fighting for. You are worth protecting. And you are worth more than the scraps of affection offered by people who see you as entertainment rather than as a human being deserving of care and respect. What happened to me changed everything about how I move through the world, how I choose relationships, how I value myself. Those 7 people thought they could hurt me without consequences, that I would accept their narrative that it was just harmless fun, that I would prioritize our friendship history over my own well-being. They were wrong. I sent them an itemized invoice for every penny their prank cost me, and when they refused to pay, I made sure the legal system held them accountable instead. I chose myself, I chose justice, I chose dignity, and I've never regretted it for a single moment. Now I want to hear from you, because your experiences and your voice matter just as much as mine. Have you ever been in a situation where someone hurt you and then tried to minimize it by calling it a joke? Have you ever had to make the difficult decision to hold people accountable even when everyone around you was telling you to let it go? Have you ever had to choose yourself over relationships that were harming you? Share your story in the comments below, because when we speak up about these experiences, we create space for others to do the same, and we build a community of people who refuse to accept that abuse is acceptable as long as someone is laughing. And if my story resonated with you, if it helped you feel less alone or gave you courage to address your own situation, I want you to do something important right now. I want you to understand that stories like this, stories about standing up for yourself and refusing to accept mistreatment, they need to be shared and amplified so that more people can hear them and find strength in them. This isn't just entertainment. This is about creating change in how we think about pranks, accountability, and the value of human dignity. So here's what I'm asking you to do. First, if this story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about pranks or accountability or self-worth, please leave a like on this video right now. That like isn't just a button click, it's a signal that stories about standing up for yourself matter, that experiences like mine deserve to be heard, that we as a community value content that empowers people rather than content that encourages them to accept mistreatment. Second, I need you to subscribe to Living Through It if you haven't already, because this channel is dedicated to sharing real stories from real people about the moments that changed their lives, the decisions that required courage, the experiences that shaped who they became. When you subscribe, you're joining a community of people who believe in the power of authentic storytelling, who support each other through difficult times, who refuse to minimize pain or dismiss trauma just because it makes others uncomfortable. And make sure you hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, because every video on this channel has the potential to be exactly what someone needs to hear at exactly the right moment in their life. Third, and this is so important, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you know someone who's been hurt by a cruel prank, someone who's struggling to hold people accountable, someone who's been told they're too sensitive or can't take a joke when they're actually responding appropriately to harm. Send them this video, let them know they're not alone, give them an example of what it looks like to choose yourself even when it's hard. And finally, I want you to take a moment to reflect on your own life, your own relationships, your own boundaries. Are there situations where you're accepting less than you deserve? Are there people in your life who regularly cross your boundaries and expect you to laugh it off? Are there parts of yourself you've diminished or hidden to maintain relationships that aren't actually serving you? Use this story as a catalyst to examine those questions honestly. And if you find areas where you need to make changes, know that you have the strength to do so, just like I did. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, for being part of this community. Remember, you matter, your well-being matters, and you deserve relationships that honor your humanity. I'm so grateful you spent this time with me today, and I'll see you in the next story here on Living Through It. Until then, take care of yourself, stand up for yourself, and never forget that you are worth fighting for.